Okay, good morning, everybody. I'm Sally Durstine. I lead our team here at the Family Business Center, and I'd like to welcome you all to our webinar this morning. We have great content and on an important topic, and also want to welcome you to our Family Business Learning community from wherever you are, whether you're participating live or virtually or from the Shore House or as a whole group, welcome. And just a word about our theme this year. We are focusing on accountability and how to create cultures of accountability. Now, this is really important in family business because of all the complexity. We all want accountability, but that's a pretty hard thing to do. So one of our theme book this year is actually The Ideal Team Player by Patrick Lencioni. If you haven't read the book yet, I highly encourage you to do that. It talks about humble, hungry, and smart traits that really drive the highest level of team accountability and performance. And this year, we're really focusing on how members are recruiting and nurturing and selecting members for all of their 5 mountains. And so just also a shout out to my team. I really appreciate the humble, hungry, and smart present in my team. Also like to express gratitude for our EDU sponsors, our educational sponsors who you see on the screen here, logos. I really appreciate their thought leadership and sharing their experience at our events. We have 2 this morning sharing, Ian and Mike. And also many of our EDU sponsors also work with you and with us very collaboratively. So a big shout out to them. This morning, you are welcome and encouraged to submit your questions. You can click on the Q&A box at any time, type in your questions. We will likely hold them till towards the end, but please do participate. And you will be able to have access to this. Probably later tonight, Karen will have it posted on our website, but we can let you know about that. So you will be able to, members will be able to have access to this. So today, really excited to present alongside Ian and Mike. We're going to be talking about the do's and don'ts of buy-sell agreements for family businesses. Now, I work with a lot of advisors, a lot of different advisors, but I particularly enjoy working with our EDU sponsors because they really understand the complexity of the 5 mountains. And so just a word, first of all, hey, Ian, how are you?
Sally, how are you? Good morning, everyone.
Good morning. And so Ian, he's the founder of his company, I Am Wealth. They're the initials for his name. Great team. They're like financial concierges. Ian's a wonderful teacher, as you'll hear later on. In fact, I invite him sometimes to our peer groups because of that. And just another word I always talk about Ian is that he makes the whole financial planning business fun. So if you've worked with Ian, I think you'll get that.
We try.
And then Mike, good morning.
Good morning, Sally. Hi, everybody.
So Mike, I've worked with a long time, Mike and his team. Mike has a lot of seasoned experience, a solid guy, deeply trust him. Sometimes it's hard to trust attorneys, but Mike is a great guy. And also we have something else in common. We both bought a Peloton in this past year, but Mike, I don't think you like yours as much as I like mine.
I do not, and it shows.
And I think the last time we presented together was on prenups. So
that's right. That's right.
So I believe that all or most of you on this Zoom call are really hoping to continue to build successful businesses and eventually pass ownership down to the next generation or maybe for the next 100 years. And one important step is a thoughtful buy-sell. So I'd like to just briefly begin by addressing what a buy-sell is, and then give a little bit of context about where this fits into the family business journey. And then we'll talk about the buy-sell components. And then we might talk about some cases along the way, you know, the good, the bad, the ugly, and the extraordinary of what we've seen in our, I think we talked about there's a cumulative 80 years experience between the 3 of us. So what is a buy-sell? Well, a buy-sell is a contract, a legal contract among co-owners that controls the transfer of ownership interests. And it addresses these 4 questions. when may an owner transfer interest, who may receive an owner's interest, what price will be paid for that interest, and how will the transfer be structured. Some might view this as kind of a prenup or a postnup for the business. Now, the purpose is really all about protection. We want to protect both the family and honor the family, and we want to protect the business and the exiting shareholders as well as the remaining shareholders. So a lot has to happen. Now, if we look at our 5-mountain process, so that slide talked about co-owners. So what mountain does this primarily take place in? It is the shareholder mountain, because this is an ownership or a shareholdership transition. Now, remember, in a family business, shareholders are almost always all family. So the family's involved here. There's a lot of emotion involved. Sometimes the same shareholder family member is also the CEO and her board member. So there's a lot going on here. Now, since buy-sells are part of the shareholder transition process, just a few other perspectives here. One that I just mentioned, that a transition in any mountain affects every other mountain. This is a system, right? So for instance, when the family CEO, when there's a new one, that affects the family. It affects even Thanksgiving dinner, right? When there's a shareholder transition, one of them dies, that affects the business. It affects the family. If we move down to the shareholder transition often has the biggest impact in the system, because we're talking about ownership. Now, these transitions occur pretty infrequently, sometimes once in a lifetime. So there's not a lot of experience. The stakes are really high. It's very risky for the family and for the business. We've worked with some clients where, the different branches, they've decided to buy each other out. But there's still a lot of family shaking, and the business is still paying for it. So it impacts the whole. And it's best when it's an intergenerational process. I'll say a little more about that later. Emotional entanglement, I colored this red because this comes from the Red Mountain, is alive and well in transition, shareholder transition. So there's a lot of senior generation ambivalence, right? This is my baby. My identity's tied up here. This brings me a lot of joy, and I'm letting go of this. And then there's rising gen challenges. A lot of emotional challenges and weight. I'd call it a burden, because, especially if I'm gifted or discounted stock, am I obligated to do certain roles or to carry this load? But it's also a legacy. It's my family. It's opportunity. So there's lots going on here. You may be interested in reading an article that I found probably 20 years ago by Yvonne Landsberg. It's called The Succession Conspiracy. It's how sometimes we just don't talk about it because it's just too difficult or painful. So just 3 principles around transition. Again, it's very important before we even get to the buy-sell that each potential shareholder needs to find their voice. Again, there's this big blob. We want to all kind of, there's togetherness, there's a lot of expectation, a lot of assumptions, but they need to find their voice and make a choice, and often do this with their spouse. So that is very, very important. That's a lot of the work we do. And secondly, can we speak with one voice? If there's more than one, can the incoming shareholders speak with one voice about what they want? So I have our shareholder mountain work here. You'll see at the base is the shareholder covenant. That's really, do we have heart-to-heart covenant around vision, values? There's a lot of stuff. If we do, then yes, let's move towards a buy-sell. And then lastly, get help from people who have experience. We'll be talking about that. Folks like us, as well as, peers. We have peer groups, and we talk about these issues in our peer groups. We have a president's group, a women's group, and a family governance group. So get help. And then one beware before we go further. Here's a don't. Don't fuse or confuse or conflate ownership planning with estate planning and wealth transfer. Now, this is tricky because the biological clock is ticking. The owner, the founder is getting older, 50s, 60s. And when they're thinking about some of this stuff, they often need to plan for ownership planning. Again, that's a shareholder mountain function, and estate planning, their wealth transfer at the same time. Now, these values and goals are different. Sometimes they're the same, sometimes they're different. Ownership planning is planning for who can own, who can steward the company best. Estate planning is around fairness and getting our estate down to the next generation. Again, this can line up, but it needs to be integrated. And often, as we know, most of the family's wealth is tied up in the business. So I have all the colors there. There's family, shareholder, management stuff going on here. And lastly, don't let the tax code create a business marriage that might shake all the other mountains. So sometimes well-meaning advisors encourage owners, parents to get the shares down. It's the tax efficient thing to do. And what they do is they create a business marriage where the next generation doesn't have a voice. Really important. So I think we're ready now to talk about some key components. I am going to flip it over to you, Ian.
Thank you, Sally. And you touched on so many important things right there that, all these stories are flashing through my head of prior experiences. Speaking of, I can't stress enough to everyone that there isn't a boilerplate template for a buy sell. And the reason why there isn't is because it is very specific and needs to be customized to you and your situation and your family and what you want to see happen. And that's why it's so important to deal with people who have experience in this area, not just the insurance person that I've been dealing with for years, or my generalized, I'll call it attorney, who we go to for everything. If that person has a specialty, great, but make sure you go to specialists for these specialties, because that really does matter. And that experience can speak volumes and really help your family over time. So I just wanted to first hit just the key components, which is the overview of what we're going to be talking about today. And, Mike and I will bounce back and forth, him being the expert on the legal side, me on more of like the planning side, and I'll explain how that works over time here. So, what are the key components? Operating agreement or partnership agreement. You may have one or the other depending upon your company structure. Don't confuse that with the buy sell. Oftentimes, and Mike will speak to this, we hear, oh, I already have that taken care of. I have one. That may or may not be true, and we'll elaborate a little bit today. It's important, as I just mentioned, to have a proper advisory team who has the experience in these particular areas. A Sally, an Ian as the planner in the middle. Then you have, Mike on his side, which is going to be the legal piece of it and give you his experience and how do we structure things. Valuation is important. What is your company worth? Easy question, difficult answer. Many different ways in the valuation business to value companies. Is there real estate in addition to the operating company, and so on and so forth? What is the buy-sell structure? How should it be? A lot of times that's dictated by what your corporate structure looks like. Triggering events. Triggering events are what happens when something happens. There could be a death. It could be a disability. It might be retirement. It might be a bunch of other things, which we'll touch on today. How are we going to fund the issue? That's where we get down to funding. There are different ways that it can be funded, whether there's cash in the bank by the business, maybe there's a bank loan that the next generation needs to take out, so on and so forth. And then lastly, and most importantly, this is not a static thing. Your business is dynamic. If I ask any business owner, do you think your business will grow? I'm hoping that the answer is yes. And if the answer is yes, well, then this has to be revisited because things will change. The business will grow. More generations will want to come up and be partners, and et cetera. So why don't we dig into it, Sally? Mike, let's talk about the operating agreement, if you don't mind. I don't know about you. I hear all the time, Ian, we already have an agreement. That's fine, Mr. or Miss Business Owner, but what type of an agreement do you have? And my experience tells me that they probably have some type of corporate document, which they're calling an agreement. And either the buy sell isn't addressed at all in that original corporate document from X years ago, and or it does have a line item about a buy sell, but it's begging a reference to some other document that may or may not exist. Talk a little bit about that if you could.
Yep. So you're exactly right, Ian. Is typically what we see is the buy sell provisions in an organization really depend upon the structure of the organization. So if you have a standard corporation, either a C corporation or an S corporation, the governance of that corporation is usually documented in their bylaws. And a buy-sell agreement would be a separate document that we'll get into the details of, that will govern ownership, transition of ownership, who can buy, who can sell, all that kind of stuff that we're going to get into. In contrast, if you have a partnership or a limited liability company, typically you see the buy-sell provisions embedded in that operating agreement or in that partnership agreement. But again, it's important to make sure all those things exist. I mean, what we find on the front end, frankly, is that when people are forming companies, and I know our audience has a lot of established companies, but it may be even people forming an entity to operate own and operate the real estate that's associated with the company, is that people are in a hurry to get the entity formed in order to finalize the transaction or to start the business, buy the real estate, whatever they're trying to do. And frankly, the buy-sell agreement, the buy-sell provisions require so much thought and consideration, as we'll talk about, that oftentimes they just come to the lawyer and say, I just want a partnership agreement or an LLC agreement, just put together the corporation, form it, and we'll deal with it later. And many times, as you know, later never comes. So you're absolutely right that, in some cases, in all cases, people usually have the basic documentation in place, but whether that documentation includes these buy-sell provisions is really another story. And we should check up on that if we're advising a corporation or working with a corporation or an LLC, any business really.
A few other key points from experience. This isn't just about this death or disability, and we're going to get into what we're going to call triggering events later. So I'm not going to steal that thunder just yet. But we want to design this buy-sell, especially because we are speaking to multi-generational family business owners here, with a path forward in mind for future generations. So if you're a 20-something, or maybe you're a 30-something, and you may not be a partner, or you have a fractional ownership now that you hope grows over time, you look at that very differently than if you're a 50 or 60-something and you're maybe the G1 or G2 who's above that other generation I mentioned. Because if you're a younger generation, hey, I'm going to be working at this company for maybe many years, and what's my certainty that I'm ever going to get ownership? And the larger the entity, the larger the amount of family members involved, there's less certainty for that person. So if in this agreement, this buy-sell agreement, there are certain triggering events addressed, like retirement, maybe that is also not only for the person retiring, but it's definitely going to be for the person who wants a path forward. So I can't stress that enough, that yes, you may have something that you can dust off the shelf in your binder when you established your entity back in 1992. But oftentimes, especially as things have gone, more generations have come in and they want a path forward. So these things have become a lot more robust, or should have become a lot more robust over time. And that's a huge thing. Second point on this, to Mike's point, hurry and get it done. We're excited. Everyone's all lathered up. Can't wait to get the business rocking. Let's just go out and market and sell our products and do these great things. What often gets overlooked is all the fine details. And a main question, which Mike and I ask all the time, what happens if this doesn't work out and one of you or both of you or all of you decide that you want to end it? What does that look like? And oftentimes, Mike, you could probably speak this, it's a puzzling response, right? What do you mean? Like, of course it's going to work. But when it doesn't work, and maybe it's a year or multiple years later, and maybe it is a death and something that couldn't have been controlled, or maybe it just is a disagreement and there is going to be a breakup, you want to make sure that at that point where emotions are high, right? When deaths occur, unfortunately, emotions are high. Disabilities, emotions are high. Breakups, emotions are high. You don't want to then be deciding all the nuts and bolts of how this is going to go down. That's the wrong time. You want all that pre-decided so you can deal with your emotions separately. And there is, once again, some document that's going to dictate how this goes. Mike, anything you want to add there?
Yeah, I think, Ian, I think the way I phrase the question when I'm dealing with clients who want to start a business, and again, I know the people we're talking to our audience have established businesses, but they do start ancillary businesses with other people, is, what's your exit strategy? That's my question when we're forming the entity. And again, the response is often puzzling. Like, what do you mean? What's my exit strategy? We're starting a business. Well, the time to decide the exit strategy is when you're forming the business, because, everybody's optimistic about starting it. Nothing's ever going to go wrong. If you don't document it right away, you have to document it in the future, and that requires an agreement among the parties. So, it's always best to address it early if you can, and to Ian's point, to continue to update it as life goes on.
Yep. Last couple comments here. Sometimes an insurance person gets involved because the funding mechanism is oftentimes life or disability insurance for a buy-sell, and that would of course trigger in the event of a death or disability, but then the agreement never follows. So the insurance person might be the lead advisor that knows dad or mom or maybe one of the children. The insurance is written, everything in their mind is set, and we move on, but the legal agreement never makes it there. Maybe it's the opposite. We went to an attorney first. We got the legal agreement in place, but then we never answered the question how we're going to fund it. So I can't stress enough that there's multiple components here that need to come together to get the result and make sure that you have all of this decided. So we can move on.
Oops, sorry.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, and we talked about earlier how a team is so important in this. And I think we'll each talk about our roles in this. Again, these transitions are once in a lifetime, sometimes little experience. And what we do, what our primarily role has been over the past 30 years, is really paying attention to this whole mountainscape, all the mountains here, the family, the shareholders, the management, the board, helping with advisor teams. And so we're paying attention to what are the wants, the goals, the needs of the family. And again, there's many different roles that family members are playing. There's a lot of anxiety in the system, and we are not attorneys, we are not accountants, and our philosophy is let's collaborate. Let's not work in silos. We're all here for the benefit of the family. We don't want unintended consequences to happen. We all know that intent doesn't always equal impact. So there might be a lot of good intentions, but if we don't understand the intentions and the wants and the needs of both generations or all generations, then we're not going to come up with a solution that's a win-win-win. So our work is really in listening and working with the family, creating those conversations, pathways forward, and then we bring in or help to upgrade. Often it's upgrading a family's advisors. And so that's a little bit what we do, and I'm going to pass it on. So Ian, how do you fit into this team?
Well, it depends. I kind of look at it as like a straight through process, meaning that maybe Sally's going to lead the conversation because she's in conversations with the family. So DVFBC does their thing, and there becomes an insertion point in that straight through process where, hey, Ian needs to be involved because of maybe a hot button that was touched, or some opening was there or a question that was asked. Maybe it's Mike's leading it with his client. And, the intention was, hey, Mike, we need these operating agreements in place. And maybe he comes from that end and then Sally plugs into it, or Ian. So we all kind of rotate the timing sometimes of when we get involved. It's not always in the same order, but looking at the different advisory pieces on your screen, some things are coming to mind, whereas it's a collaboration. Anytime that I'm involved, Mike's involved, there's an accountant that's involved, we need to understand that we're all on the same team. We're not competing against each other. We're not trying to steal each other's thunder. We are all collectively going to bring our expertise to the table, because your tax expert / CPA knows things about you that we wouldn't know because they have all the numbers, the P&Ls, the balance sheets, the tax returns, etc. They know your corporate structure. They know exactly what that looks like. That's often then shared with a Mike and an Ian to say, all right, let's start at ground zero. What does this business even look like? They may or may not have had conversations with the family in the past about how we're going to value things. We have a company that we dealt with recently, whereas they would just value the equipment on an annual basis. So every October 1st, September 30th, what have you, they close it out and say, hey, the value of our equipment is what we're going to use as the value of the company, period. We don't want to get in any elaborate conversation about the valuation. That may or may not make sense for your business. Maybe it's some multiple of EBITDA. Maybe it could be various different approaches, but your CPA is often very involved in that. Your attorney, attorneys know deep, dark secrets that we don't share, or you don't share, I should say, Mike, right? So there's a lot of conversations that maybe then, are had about what we want to see happen there from a legal perspective, or maybe it's Sally that says, hey, I'm gone through the mountains. We've gone through the process. Is this something that you've addressed? If yes, great. If not, you need to speak with an Ian, and etc. And last but not least, I will then plug in things like the owner and maybe even the second and third generation's personal financial situations, because at the end of the day, these things are all hooked together. We have the legal, we have the tax, we have the business valuation. Can the business owner then afford to sell the business? Right? To your point earlier, Sally, oftentimes with business owners, the value of the business is the majority of the net worth and or the real estate that's affiliated with the business. Does it make sense? How does that going to work, et cetera? So we all have to work in concert, and I can't, there's no me in team there, sorry, no I in team, excuse me. There isn't me. Yeah, sorry.
And of course, it's a legal document. So Mike, anything you would add?
Yeah, I think I'll add a couple things here. First, I'll reiterate the team approach. I can't, from my standpoint, I can't say enough how valuable it is to have all of your other advisors working together on these agreements for a variety of reasons. One is that, as I think, whether it's in the slide to come or when it was the slide I already mentioned, I think one of Sally's previous slides, is that there aren't, we don't see a ton of these issues. It's where there are problems. So maybe in my 30-year career, I've seen 6 or 7. Well, maybe Sally has seen 6 or 7. Maybe the accountant has seen 6 or 7. Maybe Ian has seen 6 or 7. So it's really important, I think, to have a variety of viewpoints based on everybody's experience on how to solve a particular problem for a particular family or how to structure things. So the team approach is really important. The other thing I've found in my experience is that oftentimes as lawyers, we'll bring up an issue and we will reach an impasse with a client that can't be resolved, that we're not capable of resolving. And I think that's when we turn it over to Sally's team and say, hey, we're stuck on an issue. Can you know the family better than we can, or maybe you don't know the family, but we'd like to introduce you to the family, and maybe you can help them work through this particular issue so we can finish the agreement. And the last thing I'll mention, having to do with the attorneys, is always keep in mind who the attorney is representing in these agreements. Technically, the attorney is representing the company. The attorney drafting the buy-sell agreement should be working on behalf of the company to basically put together a document that everybody agrees on. But it's not uncommon that the attorney could also be doing the estate planning for the senior generation or representing other family members in prenuptial agreements. So there are all these potential conflicts that could arise among the attorney and the potential clients that exist here. So, one of the things we do at the beginning of every engagement and that we make sure is reflected in our buy-sell documents is we make it clear that, we are representing the company in connection with this transaction, and all of the shareholders are free to get their own separate counsel to review the agreement from their standpoint. Again, everybody's sensitive about fees and all these things, so no one is particularly excited about engaging multiple attorneys to handle something for the family. But it is important to make sure everybody knows the role of the attorney and who the attorney is representing.
Great points.
Sally, one closing comment here. If we waved a magic wand and everyone in the audience, their family was worth billions, that's with the B of dollars, it's likely at that wealth level that you would either own your own or you be affiliated with something called a family office. And just to boil down at the end of the day, what does a family office do? We have all generations in the same room at the same time discussing said issue. We have Mike as the attorney, we have Ian as the advisor, we have all the different folks that are on this slide here and more. And we go around the room and say, hey, based on the issue, how do we handle that? And then all of the different folks in the room that have the expertise, legally, here's how we would handle it for liability reasons and structure, et cetera. Then we go down to, yeah, but if we do it that way, then the leverage on the financing is going to be wacky. And then, hey, wait a minute, guys, this impacts this. So that's how wealthy families remain wealthy, because they get great advice all at the same time from the multiple disciplinary folks in the room. And I would just say to all of you on the call, this is how I've designed my business with the Financial Concierge. And this is another version of it on your screen. This is what all of you deserve. Maybe you don't have the complexities that a billions of value of net worth family has, but you definitely have some version of this and you deserve a similar treatment. So even if you have your own advisors, make sure they're talking to each other. If you like to speak with us, great. We're going to talk to each other. You need your advisors talking to each other to get you the best result.
Yes, absolutely. Great point.
All right. Valuation. You mind if I go ahead here, Sally?
Yes, go.
All right. Valuation is a sticky conversation and it could affect multiple things here, right? I mean, just to keep it simple for today's purposes, there is going to be an operating company, which is what you call your business. Maybe there are multiple pieces to that business, which all have different entities associated. Maybe they're complementary businesses. Maybe you're in just various different businesses that aren't complementary. Oftentimes there's real estate. Why would we lease, AKA rent, if we can own? So over the course of time, generations have bought the real estate and maybe you own one or more pieces of real estate. All of these things have to have a value. The question is, what is it, right? So at the end of the day, whatever the buying party is willing to pay for it is kind of the idea of a market value of something. But then we have differences between something called fair market value, and we have differences between market value. And that one word, fair, can put a big monkey wrench into what the seller agrees to sell for and the buyer agrees to buy for. Touching on methodology, if you talk to valuation experts, there's a reason why there are valuation experts. You have to agree upon the formula at some point, and there are multiple ways to attack that problem, and there are multiple different valuation metrics, and really, once again, whatever you all decide to collectively agree upon is going to be. So maybe you can talk a little bit about how your structure and fair market value versus market value can affect, what the actual value is upon the buy sell happening or triggering, Mike.
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, here's what we see in terms of most common methods of value and considerations, I guess, to take into account when you're thinking about obviously what possibly one of the most important issues that you're going to deal with. And I'll say this is also an area where we frequently see people cut corners. And I would not advise you to do that. So here's what we typically see in terms of value. The first one is where there's an agreed upon value reflected in the agreement, sort of in terms of like a certificate of value, where the idea is that every year when you guys are looking at tax returns and the performance of the company and you're sort of looking in the rearview mirror, somehow you decide upon what the value is and everybody agrees on it. And that's going to be the value if there's an event or a triggering event that somebody has to pay for an ownership interest in. So we see that frequently. And the question always is how do you get to that value, right? In some cases, it's reasonably easy. Real estate, for example, is reasonably easy. You can get a real estate appraisal and you can factor in some type of inflation component every couple of years, and you can freshen up that appraisal every year. Operating entities are a little more difficult. And what we see as being oftentimes the best solution is to come up with some kind of formula to value the company. I mean, Ian mentioned, sort of a book value approach for somebody that was a heavy equipment, had an equipment intensive industry. But the beauty of a formula is every single year when you get your financial data, financial results, you can plug the numbers into the formula and you can see what kind of value that would produce. And you can see if the shareholders are happy with that value in terms of what they would get if they had a buy or sell event happening. The importance, of the formulas also is, and we'll talk about this a little later, is you need to take into account sort of unique circumstances that may have happened in a year that may not repeat themselves. Good example is PPP loans. A lot of people, or just COVID in general, a lot of people have had great years or horrible years because of COVID. And is it really a repeatable type event? And how is that going to impact the formula that you have for value? Additional considerations to think about is if someone's getting out, if someone needs to be bought out based on death, for example, is the idea that you value the whole business and you just give them their pro rata share of their ownership of the business, which is commonly referred to as sort of fair value, I guess, Ian. And then the alternative is if somebody owns, for example, 30% of the business, do you say, well, if the business is worth $1 million, your share of the business really isn't worth $300,000, because if I tried to sell that interest in the business to Ian for $300,000, he would say, I'm not paying $300,000 for that. I can't control the business. Okay, so I have a discount for a lack of control, and I can't turn around and sell that interest in the company because there's not a market for it. So should there be discounts for lack of control or lack of marketability? Additionally, should there be discounts based upon the nature of the triggering event that occurred? And we'll talk about that a little bit later. I guess the last thing I'll mention here is one of the things we see in valuation is, should there be some type of trailer provision where an exiting owner gets to participate in the upside of a sale that happens within a particular period of time? So a good example is maybe there's an operating entity, one of the owners dies, the owner's bought out for $1 million for his, I'll say, so I can do the math, 10% interest in the entity. So we're assuming the entity is worth $10 million when he's bought out. And a year after he dies, the business is sold for $20 million. Well, he spent his entire life at the business, helping to build the business. He got bought out for $1 million, which was what was fair at the time. But a year later, the company was sold for $20 million. So oftentimes in agreements, we'll see some type of trailer provision where if somebody is bought out for death or disability, things they don't control, and the company is sold within 2-3 years, maybe they participate to some extent in that upside. So valuation is a sticky issue. It's probably the issue that we spend the most time around. And I think it's really illustrative of what the team approach is because number one, the accountant needs to be involved. Number two, typically there's a valuation expert involved. Number three, somebody like Ian has to model cash flow to make sure, and insurance and that kind of thing, to make sure you can afford it. So it's an incredibly important and complex portion of the buy-sell agreement.
Yeah, a couple other comments about valuation. I mean, you may just decide to say in your buy-sell, at the point of which there's a triggering event, we're going to go and you pick, if there's, just keep it simple, a 50-50 partnership. Partner A says, hey, I'm going to go pick an appraiser. Partner B says, I'm going to go pick my own appraiser. And maybe we take the average of the two. So maybe you don't want to be tied to some formula because if 10, 20, 30 years go by, maybe that formula ends up not being the right one to really dictate what the company's value are. So there's so many different approaches. Do you want to take the last 5 years average of EBITDA, your profit effectively of the company and use that? Do you want it the last 3? To Mike's point, COVID really threw a monkey wrench, maybe good, but oftentimes bad in many businesses, because if you had a ditch year, so to speak, in the last 3 and you're on a 3-year average, well, last year may not look the best for you. So timing is everything. And you just want to make sure that you can have a formula that's going to be timeless or as timeless as possible to address all these things.
I would also add valuation is definitely more of an art than a science, right, guys? And it really does depend on the motives of both.
No doubt. But once again, and just thinking about a retirement situation that we're dealing with right now, having these things pre-decided, are there going to be discounts applied at retirement when the shareholder who's staying or shareholders who are staying are buying out the one who wants to retire? What's that valuation metric going to be? What's your method? Like those are two huge things, because at the point at which, the person who wants out, of course, that person wants to get the highest price that he can possibly get. And the sellers want to pay the lowest price. And I know we're brothers. I know we're family members. I know we're cousins or whatever we happen to be. But guess what? This can become very adversarial, especially because those brothers, cousins, or other family members probably have some spouses who also have some opinions of their own. So we've all either lived it or can, think that way, right?
Quick question that came in while we're on trailer provisions, a question that if the company's worth goes down, is the former owner required to give money back?
Yeah, Sally, I'll say this is I've never seen that type of provision. And I think probably the rationale for not seeing that kind of provision is the person who exited, it no longer controls the sort of the future of the company. And my guess is chances are he would argue, or she would argue, that, well, if I was still there, the value of the company wouldn't have gone down. And so as a practical matter, I've never seen sort of a give back provision like that. I've always seen only allowing the exiting shareholder to participate in an upside event.
Likewise.
Okay, shall we move on to structure?
So I can't, here we go. Couldn't see a slide. Structure. There are multiple ways that you can structure a buy sell. The entity itself oftentimes will dictate the best possible way or ways that it should be. But at the end of the day, there are really three basic versions of a buy sell. You can see up there, if there's one shareholder, there's something called a one-way buy sell. I would think that for the majority of the audience, it doesn't apply here, because that does denote that on a one-way buy sell, there is one owner that's 100% owner of the entity. So I'll kind of go light on that one, but just know that even if you happen to be on this in the audience here and you say, hey, I'm G1 and I'm 100% owner, but I'm considering bringing some folks in, how do I give them some certainty? There is something called a one-way buy sell. More commonly for the folks in the audience would be that there's multiple shareholders, and then there are different versions of what that could look like. Cross purchase, entity purchase, LLC. Oftentimes tax, and here comes your tax person / CPA, has to be chiming in here along with a Mike and an Ian, simply because taxes can drive which of these structures for the buy sell make the most sense. So Mike, maybe you can speak a little bit about, hey, if I'm an S Corp, if I'm a sole prop, probably not many of those here, if I'm a partnership, how do these things plug together?
Yeah, I mean, this is sort of the structure that's typically, I'll say, chosen is, or the way the documents are typically drafted is that there's sort of an option in terms of who gets the ability to buy to buy the interests, and what we typically see, or what is typically done in a document to maintain flexibility at the beginning, at least, is that the document will say that if Mary wants to sell her interest in the company, then each remaining shareholder will have the right to purchase a proportionate share of Mary's interest in the company. If they decline to do it, then the company will have the ability to purchase the interest in the company. So in many agreements, at least initially, before there is insurance and everything like that in place, funding in place, just for flexibility purposes, Ian, what we oftentimes draft around is just making the thing flexible so that you can either do a cross purchase if you want, or you can do an entity purchase. As we deal with more established companies, there's usually a mechanism that's decided upon by the CPA, by the insurance advisor, as to how it's going to be done. And you're absolutely right that it may be something from a tax standpoint that is advantageous for a particular structure. So, for example, one of the things with a cross purchase is that people find advantageous is that if a cross purchase is done, meaning shareholders each buy some interest in the departing shareholders' ownership, the purchasing shareholders get basis in the stock that they're buying or in the LLC interest or partnership interest that they're buying. If we have the entity buy the interest, so we basically redeem out the existing owner, and the remaining shareholders are, proportionately increased in terms of their ownership, they're not going to get basis. So the CPAs may have a problem with that. The other thing that gets a little bit, funky in some of these things is maybe not all shareholders have equivalent rights to purchase. So maybe we have a situation where Ian and his sister are partners in an entity with Mike and his brother. And the agreement is written that if Mike dies, my brother has the first opportunity to purchase my shares. So in that sense, an entity purchase wouldn't work because we want to maintain 50-50 ownership between Mike's family and Ian's family. So, the structure, number one, is dictated by business concerns like what I just described. But you can't be oblivious to the tax issues either. So again, I think you guys are getting the theme here that this is why there needs to be so many different parties involved in these, in thinking about the proper way to structure these documents. And then I'm sure Ian's going to jump in and tell you that, he doesn't want to buy 75 insurance policy, have you buy 75 insurance policies to insure all your shareholders when maybe he only has to buy 5 insurance policies or help you buy 5 insurance policies. That's another issue.
So maybe to clarify a few fine points of what Mike was describing. So just to keep it simple, if there's 2 partners and they're 50-50 and all these other ancillary issues don't exist, what would probably be, say Mike and I are partners in a business. If Mike wants to retire, if Mike passes away, if Mike gets disabled, I probably don't want to be partners, no disrespect to your wife, Mike, she's lovely, but with Mike's wife. Because at the end of the day, just keep it simple. If Mike was to pass, well, then that means that his estate would probably go to his wife. His wife now owns shares, 50% of which the company that we both owned, Mike and I. So now we're in a situation where she may not have been involved in the business and all the things that happen there. I would want to say, wait a minute, I want to be 100% owner of that. So this structure would simply say in a cross purchase that I come up with some funding, and we can talk about that in a moment, come up with the cash in exchange for the cash that I buy out for Mike's shares based upon valuation, et cetera. Then his spouse would then hand over the shares to me. So what happens is the equity that he was due, or in this case, his spouse is due in exchange for all his hard work over the years in owning the business, is exchanged for me for the shares. And now I get to own the business. I move on, run the business. She gets paid. Everyone's happy. That gets a little stickier when there are 3 partners, or maybe there's 4 partners, or maybe there's 6, 10, or 20 partners, depending, right? It can get very sticky. So, going back to the funding mechanism, one of which is buying a life insurance policy. In a cross purchase, I would own a policy on Mike and Mike would own one on me. And then the agreement ties that together as far as mandating who gets paid. But if there are 3, now all of a sudden we all have to own on each other. If there are 4, so Mike was being a little facetious when he said 75, but that could really happen. And that gets, from a practicality perspective, very difficult to administer. So LLC, for example, entity purchase is a better way to handle that. And basically what it says is that there's an LLC for the sole purposes of owning the life insurance policies. There is one policy on each person who's an owner in the company. That LLC is owned pro rata to the ownership of the operating company or whatever said companies in question that we're protecting. And then we only need one policy there. Not to get in the weeds, but one more point about taxes. The tax issue doesn't occur to the person who is receiving the funds. Going back to the Mike and Ian example, God forbid Mike was to pass, his spouse would get a check. There's no tax issue there. The tax issue would be mine, depending on how this is set up, because maybe I don't get a step up in basis for the payment that I gave. Now, what does that mean? It means that the IRS is going to say, Ian, you get no credit for that check you handed over as basis or the cost that you put into it, the principal. Now, there's a gain position at some point when I sell. And if that isn't structured properly or thought through properly, it's potential that I get no credit for the $500,000 or $1 million I handed over, and they consider all that gain later on. So It's the shareholders who are remaining that oftentimes have the tax issue that we're talking about. I just want to be really clear about that. It's not the departed person because they're not here. It's not the departed person's family because that's not an issue. It's really the remaining partners that would go to sell the business in the future or would pass in the future, et cetera. Does that make sense? All right. Maybe we'll talk a little bit about triggering events. Okay. I'm going to brief over this slide, everyone, and then I'm going to ask Sally to give me the ability to share because I want to show you an actual document that we use to walk through, the Sally, Mike, and Ian conversation with the family. So you can see what these triggering events are. Once again, you're going to find out that it's more than just what we called on the slide, the traditional death and disability. When Mike mentioned earlier that collectively, we have maybe seen, 15, 20 examples over our 80-year history combined experience here of, wow, somebody passed away and this was a big problem. The good news is people don't often pass with this issue, right? They pass after they've already retired. Disability is, very, very detrimental and it's pretty rare. So that's what he was kind of speaking to. We do often see issues with, hey, I want out because maybe I just want out. It's an amicable, or maybe, as we said, an unamicable situation, or maybe retirement. Those are things that are much more prevalent. So we're going to touch on those things in our considerations. But I can't stress enough, this isn't about just death or disability. And Mike, I don't know about you, but that's oftentimes what our business owners think when we say the words buy, sell. They think, hey, we already got it covered. Death, disability, we're good. What about all these other things that can happen? I don't know if you have any overarching comments before we get into the triggers here.
Yeah, no, but that is what people tend to think about. And I try to tell them is, well, what if you guys can't agree anymore? Or one of you gets just tired of working. How are you going to bail out? How are you going to figure out how to get out, at what cost, who's going to pay for it, all that kind of stuff. So I agree with you.
Great. Sally, you mind?
Sometimes we think of the 4 Ds: death, disability, divorce, and disagreement, which is what you said. I'll stop sharing now, Ian.
Please.
Great.
All right. Sally, can you see?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
Should say shareholder intent for updating.
Yes.
Right? All right. So I'm just going to briefly hit some fine points because there's a lot of information here. Mike, Sally, ask you to chime in anytime if you have any comments as we go through. So one of the things that we usually start with is who's eligible to be a shareholder. And once again, this is stuff that you definitely want to think about when you're starting a new entity, whether it's a new business you're starting, or if you haven't thought about this, or your buy sell doesn't address these kinds of things, you need to go back and at least evaluate them. So who can be your shareholder? Like we had said here with this particular group, you must be a direct descendant. Spouses are not allowed in this family to become shareholders. Maybe in your family, you think that that's okay, but that's something you definitely want to define. Maybe they're spouses now, or maybe they're spouses to come, right? Multi-generations. Maybe you have never met these people who are the spouses of yet. Must they work full-time, or could they just work part-time? Or maybe they never worked at the company. Can you just show up and become a shareholder from day one? Maybe you have, we want you to cut your teeth a little bit before that happens. And maybe there's a time limitation on that. How old? Maybe there's a minimum required age that we don't want someone with less than a certain amount of experience due to the time that they spent on this planet to be a shareholder, or maybe we're okay with it. Full-time versus part-time. And this was talking about having a specific role. Maybe you start off from the ground up and you sweep the floors, then you move up level by level. And we want you to at least become a manager so that you know the runnings of the company, not just what it's like to be an employee of the company before you're eligible to be a shareholder. All shareholders must transfer shares by age 70. Now, this gets interesting. To me, this is one of the most important components because I think this gives clarity, as I referenced earlier, to the future gens. If I'm a 20-something and my grandfather or my father is in their 50s or 60s, I look at this and say to myself, what path forward do I have? And if there isn't some type of, and this is a pretty strong term, mandatory force out, then maybe I never get the shot at partnership. Maybe I'm just a well-paid employee over the course of years, and maybe I'm the one helping grow this company. So that would be really important to me, that I know that at some point there's an absolute end to shares become available. How are we going to approve it when it comes? There has to be with the board of director or the existing shareholders, or however you want to term that. What are the guidelines as far as, stewardship responsibilities? You must contribute to this. So these are different things that you must exhibit to become a shareholder. And usually these are fairly broadly defined, if at all, so that you can, insert different specific definitions under this. You must have character, competency, commitment, consistently fulfill the requirements as discussed, right? So you want to have things like this, which also then sets up the opportunity for how would we get rid of a shareholder if they aren't marching to the beat, or there's certain things that have come up, right? So that's kind of the overarching. Who can even be a shareholder in the beginning? We start there. Now we get into what the slide was about specifically, which is the triggering events. In the case of death, what exactly happens? And then we lay that out specifically about who's eligible, how that's going to work, who agrees to what, et cetera. And you can read. In the case of death, we also need a funding mechanism. So for reference only, some notes about the life insurance, right? There's going to be some reference to how we're going to fund it in this document as well. And usually, Mike, maybe you can speak to this. There's a schedule that's going to lay out what that funding mechanism looks like. If there's life insurance policies, what's the company name? What's the policy number? What's the death benefit amount? Maybe you can speak to.
Yeah, it's just, I'll say this is, it's just, there's always a schedule attached saying what, if any, life insurance policies are supporting this buy-sell agreement or disability policies. And it's just important to keep that updated, and it's important that the right beneficiaries are named. So again, going back to the team approach, when the document's done, the exhibits better be right, and the insurance designations better be right as well.
Yeah. This even started to get into more specifics about the company as G3 comes up, will then purchase life insurance as a funding mechanism. So not only does it say, here's the schedule of what we have in place today, but how will this go as more rising gens come up to be shareholders in the company, right? In the case of a disability, what happens if something happens? Oftentimes, and Mike, once again, chime in, or Sally, we hear from our business owners that, hey, don't worry about it. We'll just pay that out of current cash flow. I can tell you one specific story before I ask for your input here, that we had a certain situation where grandfather started the company G1. There were two brothers that got involved in the company. One had a like, call it real estate background, just to keep it general. Said, hey, we should design and build this building for our next level of the business to look like this. So they designed the building, they build the building. Now all of a sudden, the three of them, dad and two brothers, are going to now rock it out with the building, or with the business rather. Not too soon after that, that one brother became disabled, permanently disabled. And that brother then was paid out of cash flow from profits for 25 plus years, because you're not going to leave your brother, your son, whoever it may be, kind of out in the ocean with no life preserver, with no income. But guess what? That becomes, kind of a grinding or grading type of thing over time on the rest of the family members, especially after time has passed. How long are we going to keep on doing this, Dad? And Dad's saying, hey, that's my son. We're going to keep on doing it until we can't do it anymore. And everyone else is saying, but wait a minute, that's hurting the bottom line. And my profit distribution is suffering because of N, right?
Yeah.
I don't know if you want to chime in here.
Yeah, I think that's a good example of a discussion that's a lot easier to have when everybody's healthy, than when you actually have to deal with it. So it's, oftentimes the beauty of dealing with these buy-sell agreements is that, you could picture yourself on either side. You could be the person who's disabled, who knows, or you could be the person who has to continue paying the disabled person. So it's important that it be addressed, because it can be a tremendous financial drain and cause a ton of resentment, as Ian sort of indicated in his example.
Yeah. At first,
Great.
everyone's okay with all these issues because the event just happened. Over time is where the issues start to show their heads, right? We talked about this not just being a death or disability conversation. At some point, likely everyone's going to want to retire, or at some point we want someone to retire once again to make room for future gens. So what does that look like? What's the minimum age? What's the maximum age? And the world is your oyster here. Once again, if you're G1 and you're now updating your buy sell, you probably look at this differently because it's dictated on your terms. I'm the one who started the business. How do I want this to go? Here's how long I want to stick around. You have to kind of hash that out. And it's a great idea to do it with your children or whoever it may be in your family. because you want a clear path for them so that they are clear, you are clear, and we all know what's going to happen. And then you can also prepare. So, just speaking to this briefly, we oftentimes have what I'll call vacillation. I want to retire. Yeah, I'll be ready next year. Next year comes, nah, not yet. How many
We
times
call
have we
that
heard-
the 5-year rolling plan.
Yes, which, hey, might be fine for you if you're the one in the driver's seat. But if you're the one in the passenger seat, not okay. Hey, dad, hey, grandpa, hey, brother, hey, whoever you are, please, can we please call it? Let's go. I want to get my life on too. And my wife's talking to me about when's this going to happen and all the things that we can imagine, right? All right. In case of a reduction to part-time work before that happens, right? So, there's all kinds of nitty-gritty things I don't need to touch on necessarily. What happens if you voluntarily or involuntarily maybe terminate your employment? I'm a shareholder. Maybe I involuntarily, because maybe I got caught up in some criminal thing that I didn't intend to get caught up on, or maybe I have a drinking problem, or maybe I have a drug problem, or many things that just kind of happen to people over time. Can I still be a shareholder? What's the mechanism for that? Do I get anything, or is it just, hey, guillotine drops and I'm done? Is there some type of buyout for that? Do I, et cetera? What happens if I voluntarily decide to leave? It's not a retirement scenario. I just want to do different things with my life. Is it okay for the remaining shareholders, for someone who decided to go a different direction for whatever reason, because they chose, to still be a shareholder? These are all very, different scenarios. And once again, life experience is what brings us to this. Right of first refusal. That was what Mike was touching on before. Is there anyone that you want to give the first right of refusal for your shares, or does it just go back into the pot? Everyone has to agree to that. We started to get into certain other things that I just want to touch on briefly, because not all these things apply to everyone, but the valuation and the payment mechanism, et cetera. But this I thought was an interesting one. Is there any type of additional discount that's applied to the buyout price depending upon the age? So in other words, if I was 25 and eligible, become a shareholder, then all of a sudden I'm only there until I'm 40. I've contributed to the growth of the company for 15 years, the profits of the company, the direction of the company, but then I decided I went out. Do I get full value of that? Or must I be there for 20 years or 30 years or 40 years? And that's something that, you definitely want to think about as existing shareholders. Do you want to have some type of vesting effectively on what that looks like, which is effectively how that discount works? And it's based upon age, or it could be based upon tenure, or what have you. Do we require shareholders to have some type of prenup if they're going to get married, or maybe post-nup conversation had after they're married that then coincides with this? Because if you get divorced and that's an asset, we want to make sure that I'm not a shareholder along with your ex-spouse. That can get very, very sticky, as we all know. We talked about the clawback provision, or in this case, we're talking about trailer windfall. There's different versions of this, but an example of, we had a shareholder who said, hey, let's, buy me out. A discount was applied, 20% on the one, 40% on some other entities. So let's say on $1 million, for every million, there was $400,000 paid out. And then the remaining shareholder owned the company outright now. That's worth $1 million, but, basically bought it for 400, to the other one, and then went and flipped the company for 3 times the price the year later. To Mike's point, how fair is that? Right? Maybe that was all in the works before I even came to you and said, I want to sell, and you knew that was happening. So now you bought me out at a discount, but then got a triplicate multiple on the company. So just want to keep in mind, everyone, this is not a buy-sell agreement that you're looking at. This is a document with some different prompts that Sally and Ian, Mike collectively basically go to our business owners and say, as a shareholder, these are some things you're thinking about. And this is how we collect the data and tell a little bit, just a few stories and fill in the blanks. This then becomes, I'll call it the guideline, or as it, it says up there, what's the intent of the family? Mike can then dot the I's and cross the T's on the legalities of it.
And I would add, as Ian went through some of this, the shareholder eligibility, that probably was ringing a bell with some of you. Oh, that's shareholder employment policy stuff. So different conversations are held in different arenas, and then they're brought together. And as you can imagine, if you haven't entered into these conversations, there's some pretty awkward and critical and frank conversations.
Yep.
Can you see that again?
I can.
Great.
Wonderful.
So funding.
So how are we going to fund it? You know, what we've talked about so far is there's lots of different structural components to how we're going to set up the buy sell, and the legal piece of it about, okay, here's the directions, here's the prescription of how it's going to go. Now we just have to come up with cash, whether it's a retirement, whether it's a death, a disability, et cetera. We need to have some predetermined way that this is going to happen. So some ways that you can think about this, and I'll actually show you a spreadsheet version, and I'll go light on the numbers part, but just so you can see how we take a look at today and the future. If, you know, oftentimes if you decide, hey, I'm not going to use any leverage of life insurance, disability insurance, or any of that, I just don't like that. You know, insurance is a 4-letter word to folks. So be it. Get your legal document in place, but you have to have an answer on how we're going to do it. The thing that you want to remember is that you're going to be using post-tax dollars for those buyouts, right? There's not going to be an ability, unless Mike chimes in differently here, in most cases, to use pre-tax dollars. So just know that if you make $1 in the company, or there's $1 in the company bank account, that we would use cash, as the first bullet says, or maybe we've created something called a sinking fund, which is nothing more than building up a fund over time for a future value that, you know, if the thing happens, we have a place to go. You're using post-tax. So knock 30 cents, 35 cents, whatever your tax bracket is off. And now we have whatever's left over to fund it. Maybe you're just going to use cash flow. And oftentimes, if there is no other answer, we don't want to use the cash in the bank because that could cripple the company in the short run. We need that cash, or maybe there's just not the cash there. We're going to do what we look at the P&L of the company over the past couple of years. We're going to do a future projection and say, here's how the company can afford, with the remaining ownership, to fund the departing party out of cash flow. And that may actually dictate the amount of the buyout. In some cases, it may dictate absolutely the terms of the buyout. You know, if I'm retiring, if my wife was a partner or something, and she passed away and I'm the recipient, you know, hey, I want that money quick, right? In fact, I want it all today. My interest is worth $10 million. Give me my money today. No. There's no mechanism for that. We can't kill the company. So as a result, we need to take this cash flow, and maybe that's going to dictate it needs to be a 15-year buyout, Ian. So now I'm I'm going to Thanksgiving dinners. I'm going to Christmas events. I'm doing whatever I'm doing and seeing all you folks, knowing that you're paying me out over 15 years. And my concern would be, what happens if the company fails? You know, there's all kinds of things that can happen over 15 years, or maybe I just need the money now. I just want to end this, right? Sorry, I lost my slide. Lastly, it can be financed, right? So if you're not going to go the insurance route for death or disability specifically, it can be financed. So what does that mean? It means that the remaining shareholders have to go out and borrow money in some capacity. Maybe they're borrowing money from the selling party. You know, if you're G1 and you say, hey, I don't mind getting paid over time, you're effectively holding the note, quote unquote. You're financing the purchase. Or maybe if you want more upfront, or that's not the way you want to go for other reasons, maybe you're going to require the next generation to buy you out and go borrow the money from a bank, and they have to pay whatever the going interest rate is. Mike, any comments about, you know, the non-insurance route for this?
Yeah, I'll just jump in on a couple payment related issues, Ian, that I say we tailor in the documents depending upon the preference of who we're working with. You know, one thing with respect to insurance that we see is that it's every now and then you see a provision in a document where maybe there's a down payment required. You know, you're going to, somebody dies, you're going to pay 20% of the purchase price and upfront, and the balance is going to be paid over time. You know, one issue we've seen as an ambiguity in a document is, if there's insurance, does that count towards the down payment or does not count towards the down payment? Oftentimes, as Ian said, there's payments over time. What interest rate should we use? Should it be a market rate of interest, so we're getting a fair rate of return, or should it be the lowest rate of interest that's allowed by the IRS, which is called the applicable federal rate? Should the payment arrangement be secured by the ownership interest or unsecured? So if you default on the payment, do you get your ownership interest back? And then the last thing that we see with respect to payment is oftentimes the payment terms might be varied based upon the triggering event. So if you die, maybe you get paid out over 7 years. Your estate gets paid out over 7 years. If you leave because you involuntarily for cause, because you had a chronic alcohol problem that prevented you from doing your job, maybe you get paid out over 10 years, or you voluntarily left, you get paid out over 10 years. So those are the types of variations we see in respect to payment terms. And you know, I didn't have much in the way of comments on actual funding mechanisms. I mean, I think you covered what the potential options are here.
Yeah, if open to it, and if healthy age comes into it. So from an old versus young perspective, it's affordability issues. Usually we measure and we actually get down to what is the actual leverage on the life insurance. If I put up a certain amount of cents, how many dollars does that equal? Does it equal 80 cents if I put up 20? Does it equal $1 or $1.30? In other words, the premium on the life insurance or disability insurance must create enough leverage on the payout that if the event was to happen or when it was to happen, it actually works. And that was cheaper than using post-tax cash, creating a sinking fund, the cash flow, the financing, all the above, right? So that's why most oftentimes, once again, if open to it and the economics of it makes sense based upon health, age, and et cetera, life insurance is used as a funding mechanism in the event of death. Disability insurance specifically would be then a tax-free payout on that disability insurance. So that's the way that we fund the disability component to it. So I saw a question pop up, Sally. I don't know if you want to hit that question.
Yeah. So one question came up, significant differences. What are the significant differences when shares are gifted versus bought out?
When we say significant, that's a very broad question. So
That is a broad
Mike, you want to
question.
maybe hit that generally and I can chime in? Perspective,
Yeah, I'm not
maybe.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure what question's being asked, Sally. Does it have to do with, you think it has to do with how they should be repurchased when they were gifted as opposed to bought? Or are we talking
Yeah,
about tax issues? What do you,
I mean,
maybe we can get a little bit of clarity on the
that.
question.
I will say
Yeah.
this. G1s, G2s, whichever the oldest generation in play, maybe getting a little bit on the older side. They're getting into their 60s. They're looking maybe 70s, 50s for that matter, and saying, I may want to exit. And part of my exit strategy is that I don't want my children, just to keep the example simple, to have to buy in 100%. Maybe I want to do some type of combo. I want to gift. Maybe I want to gift all of it. If I'm financially well off, that's just what I want to do for my family. Maybe I want to gift some and I want to have them finance others. You know, you want to have some type of structure around that first of all creates, you know, an equitable situation. Because if you have multiple children, when are we going to do this? What is the price at which? So we have a situation that we dealt with more recently where part of it was gift, part of it was buy-in, but all the children are different ages, which makes sense. So does it make sense for, you know, the fourth child or the fifth child to be buying in at a similar price as the eldest child? You know, if I'm the eldest, I don't think that that's fair. You know, I helped create some of the value here. And now my brother, my sister, whoever it may be, is going to buy in at some discount after the company's worth more. So there has to be some well thought out there. The only other thing I'll say about gifting, age is a huge component. And this is where the personal financial planning comes in. Unless the first generation or the generation who's considering the gift is extremely well off, or maybe they're extremely up in age, where they're definitely not going to need the money. If it's not that situation, then you really have to be thoughtful about gifting something that once you gift it, you're not going to want to ask for it back. So, you know, you're gifting the shares, you're gifting the profitability of the company, because usually, you know, in S corporations, you know, the profit's going to be distributed pro rata to the ownership. So if I give up 10 or 15 or 20% to my children this year, I'm giving up 20% of my profit distribution next year. So that's something that we just think through and really model that back into what does your personal financial situation look like if you're the giftor? And what does your estate plan look like if you're the giftor?
And Ian, you were going to show some things to that
I
end.
am, yeah. Do we get any clarity on the gift question? I just don't want to.
No. So why don't we move to that and then maybe that'll come up again.
Sure,
I'll
not a
stop.
problem. Yeah, happy to answer it if it does. Okay. All right. This is going to look a little busy, everyone. Sally, can you see this spreadsheet here?
Yes, it's up.
Okay. I'll keep this very simple and maybe we'll spend maybe a minute or so here. Oftentimes when we talk about any of these type issues, and so far today, it's been exactly that, we're not looking at the specifics surrounding the issue. We're talking about specifics, but we're not looking at anything. What I mean, the difference is, putting numbers on a page sometimes provides tons of clarity as to, oh, now I see how it's going to work, not just this concept type of thing, right? And we do the best we can on the concept, but we oftentimes get down to this level with folks and say, listen, and I'll just use this by way of an example. Let's say there's a $5 million operating a family business, and there's multiple family members involved. There's also the real estate that the business owns, and that's worth $1 million in this example. So the total value of everything, the way we look at it as a family, is $6 million. Do we want to apply a discount if we're selling to our family? I'm going to assume no for purposes of this exercise. So we're going to be at the same 6 million. If you said, Ian, apply a 20% discount. Well, now the sale price is going to be 4.8, even though the total is $6 million. But I'll just avoid that issue for now. Now we have mom or dad as a shareholder, 25%. We've gifted are at a point now where we're thinking about going to a structure where, mom and dad maybe own more of it now, but they want to go to an equitable situation where all 3 kids are going to own 25% or 25% each. And dad's going to say, hey, I'm going to keep my last 25%. What does that look like in dollars? What do I really own? Well, 25% of the company, $5 million operating company, is $1.25 million. 25% of the real estate's $250,000. So I own $1.5 million of stuff of the 6, and so do my 3 children, right? Now we kind of move down here and say, what might this look like in the future? Once again, back to the question, and the answer better be yes to everyone on this call, I hope. Do you think your business will grow in the future? If the answer is no, well, then we put a 0 here, and there is no growth. If the answer is yes, let's apply some percentage growth just so we can see what it does to the numbers. This is how the 1.25% interest that dad retains would grow over time. And maybe that's important to dad here because I'm only 52. I don't really want to get out of the business until I'm 65. So I'm going to get paid as an employee, even though I'm giving up my ownership interest for the function I provide. And in addition to that, I'm going to get 25% or 1/4 of whatever the profit distribution is. But lastly, I want to know when I do decide to finally call it quits, and I'm thinking 65 in this example, that when I'm out, what does that thing look like? Well, 25% of the future value of the company might be around $2.4 million. If we just value the real estate, once again, a quarter of which is 250, growing at 3%, I have real estate value that's worth 367. Here's when I get the final payout, so to speak, from my kids. When they buy out the rest of the company from me, I theoretically would get another 2.7 million. So as a financial advisor, the person putting together the financial plan for the owners that are looking at how this should work today and saying, how much can I afford to gift or sell? What does it look like when I do get my retirement check, or maybe it's a payout over time? I want to know what that value is. I want to know if it's going to work for you personally, as well as for the company. The only last thing I'll touch on here is from a current coverage. In this example, these folks have $500,000 of life insurance. And when we first met, Ian, we're all set. I said, well, that's fine. But even if after you gift this, if the value is 1.5 between real estate and the operating business, Joe, let's call him, and there's only $500,000 of funding mechanism, are your 20-something kids who are now owners in the business bankable enough to go out and give you the rest? Or are you going to deal with some type of payout? Because it looks like you're about $1 million short of your goal. Maybe we need to add in the other $1 million so that there is no short of the goal. And even if you didn't add in the $1 million today, the thing we want to understand is there's going to be something left short no matter what, because once again, is your business going to grow? Yeah, and it is. Do you think the real estate that you own or the piece of the real estate you own is going to appreciate over time? Yeah, and it is. So going back to what we'll talk about lastly, which is you have to revisit this. What made sense at that time was simply that. It was a moment in time. We need to address this over time and say, listen, there's a shortfall. How are we going to cover that shortfall? So I thought that might be interesting just so that we can walk through the construct. And of course, we're much more specific when we're talking to our business owner about their situation.
Good stuff. Okay, we back Here we are.
Ongoing review. Mike, I'll ask you to add some comments. Sally, same here. You know, it's basically what we just talked about. You may have an agreement, you may not. If you don't, well, then obviously we have to go from nothing to something, ideally, your choice. If you have something, please make sure you actually have a buy sell. As we started at the outset, if you're on from the beginning, many business owners confuse their operating agreement, partnership agreement. You know, is there really a buy sell provision? And then secondarily, what does it actually say? I would definitely revisit that. I would put actual numbers to it. You know, what's the value of the company today versus what it was? Has the ownership changed over time? So there are different shareholder names or maybe different ownership percentages. You know, you may even want to revisit this annually if your family's that dynamic and you're gifting or selling shares over time. So I can't stress enough that all the things that we have here from top to bottom need to be addressed multiple times throughout your company's life.
And I would add, while you're addressing that, it's a good time to, at least our work with families, is to be addressing all of those types of documents, other shareholder documents and family documents. Just make it a matter of protocol, because all of a sudden time gets lost and it's been a few years.
Yeah.
I agree, and things change. I mean, the one example we brought up was valuation and PPP loans and COVID and all that kind of stuff. And, you know, if you don't have an up-to-date agreement and something happens and you're stuck with a formula that takes into account, doesn't factor into account those kinds of extraordinary events, you could be in trouble.
So we want to share a case or two, but before we do that, just a note again that this buy sell is done in the context of partnerships, you know, a business marriage. And so that the best partnerships are always chosen, not arranged. So it's intergenerational, and that these partnerships should be aligned and competent and committed. And then we come down to, and yes, also do create a buy sell so that there are clear, graceful ways to exit. We talked about this multiple times. We can't predict or understand all the things that are going to happen in the future. So it's important to have these conversations when we're not in the midst of the emotional swirl. So I am going to actually stop sharing here for a minute. Let's talk about some cases. Ian, do you want to go first? Do you have either a good, bad, ugly, or extraordinary?
Yeah, you know what? Because this is going to be my final example. I know I've interspersed some, but, you know, I figured we would end on a positive note because, you know, these are all death, doom, destruction type of conversations. Oftentimes when you're saying beware, beware. I have a wonderful story, and you know, I say wonderful, it is bittersweet because the business owner I was very fond of and dealt with him and his family for lots of years, put in place all kinds of planning, which I'll get into. And unfortunately, it worked, right? And I say unfortunately because we don't like to see these things really work, but we are very thankful and we're very grateful. And most importantly, the continuity that this provides and the certainty for the remaining folks that are still here, that they can continue to run the business, you know, they're so thankful for everything that we do at the end of the day. And they still thank me to this day. And we're talking 2015. So what's that, 6 years we just passed. So here's kind of the generic story. Large family-owned business. At the time where I met the family, the owner, who was the G1, we'll call him, had two G2s, two of his children in the business. There was a third G2 who was still not there yet, just due to age. And this business was started. It was an unbelievable business, the Philadelphia area, service-based business, and it just grew like wildfire over time. I mean, this person was so special. I mean, everyone knew this person in that world and kind of looked at him as the godfather. They own multiple real estate locations in addition to multiple operating businesses that were all complementary to what they did. Not only were the businesses very valuable and very profitable, but this also caused an estate problem that we addressed along the way for this G1 person. As we started to talk over time, and this was an overtime conversation, we started to talk about the personal financial situation in concert with the businesses and how they're operating, in concert with, you know, what is the path forward for the two children that we're in, and then when this third child comes along, how do we want that to look? And, you know, through those conversations, we got tons of clarity about what that would be. went through the process that we just talked about. Sally, I know at the outset you mentioned, hey, don't let the estate plan dictate. The way that I received it, and I would ask everyone else in the audience to receive it, is don't let the estate tax tail wag the dog, or don't let the tax, generally speaking, wag the dog. I think that we want to consider estate tax planning when we're doing this. And as I elaborate here, I'm glad we did. But to fast forward the story, unfortunately, the G1 person passed away. Well known in the community, huge. I mean, just a hole in this area of the world based upon what happened. And the first comment that I got, even though the two children were in the business, the first question was, Ian, are we going to lose the business? That was what they were worried about after they, because obviously they're grieving. Their father just passed away, and this was, unbelievable. They were so close. But they real life concerns. The first of which is, oh my gosh, is my entire life going to change here? And that's a very appropriate question. And I could look them dead in the eye with certainty and say, you're fine. Everything we did is going to trigger now. And because of what we did and all the time we spent, sometimes money, sometimes time, it's all going to work out. You're not going to lose the businesses. You're not going to lose the real estate. So fast forward the story. We had all the buy sells in place properly. They were funded so that everyone who had ownership would basically remain owners. They were funded such that the spouse of this person could be bought out because, they love their stepmom in this case, but don't necessarily want to be partners in the business that way. What was in concert with this is that this person was worth well over the estate tax number. So we had other planning in place that kind of spoke to what the buy sell and the other provisions were of the business. So we had mechanisms to limit the estate tax as much as we could, and we worked on them over time. But at the end of the day, Mike can talk about this maybe a little specifically. You can't eliminate, if you're worth a certain amount of money, all the tax, although you try. Then you have to have a funding mechanism to be able to pay the tax off to the side. Just FYI, some of this is still being talked about between the family and the IRS. Like, it's still not final, and we're 6 years into it, and we did everything right. So I only bring that up because I think it's going to be a favorable outcome. But the reason why I bring it up is, even if you do everything right, it's a little sticky, right? If you don't have any planning in place, or you don't do things right, effectively do them wrong, you can only imagine what the issues are. I mean, you don't have a leg to stand on. So at the end of the day, the beautiful thing about this is the business is not only doing well, it's thriving. That third child I mentioned earlier is now in the business. They are equal partners, and they're running this hugely successful business. We are still working with the same CPA who helped dad grow the business over time and is still very involved in the business today. We have, ongoing conversations about how we can grow it and what entities were. And then we had to redo all of this again, right? Because now the ownership changed. We had to redo the estate planning. The pre and post nups have to be in concert with the operating agreement, which have to be in concert with the buy sell, which has to be in concert, with whatever the estate planning is of the children. So, lots of conversations, but at the end of the day, the outcome was as good given the situation as it possibly could have been. And I think that's what everybody wants. They want the business to continue on and the shareholders remaining to be able to carry that torch. And with proper planning, whatever the situation is, you can make that happen.
Do you want to add anything there, Mike? And then I have one as well.
No, I'm good.
Good.
Yep.
Yeah. So the one I'm going to talk about, it has some really painful parts, but it's coming back up. So the situation that I'm thinking of is a father who thought that he was going to live forever. Entrepreneurs often do, working so hard in the business, building it wonderfully. Also, this family, there's blended family. So we have that component. We also have special needs child, and he passes away unexpectedly. Now, a few years before, he had gathered the family, teenage and up, in the attorney's office and just kind of said, hey, sign these documents, we're all good. And they had no idea what they were getting into, had no idea what this business marriage looked like. Since then, they've done a lot of hard work, a lot of painful conversations. There's been some unraveling that we were part of, and another advisory team as well in unraveling. And the good news is that some who were owners in the business and actually working in the business have carved a new way, a new path for themselves. It might not look good on the outside, but it's looking good to the family. And that's where my primary interest is, in making sure the soul of the family and the individuals are really flourishing as well. So in this case, a lot of bumpiness because there wasn't that kind of preparedness, and now they're finding their way back. So we want to encourage you to do the hard work of buy, sell, and everything we talked about earlier. You are welcome to give us a call. Contact us if you don't have Mike and Ian's information. Let me know, and I'll pass that on to you if you'd like to speak with one of them. And just briefly talk about our next event coming up. We have two. Our one in September is actually going to be focused on the Advisor Mountain. This year we focused on each mountain. This is the last one. So we're going to be talking more about the value of, we call it a PAC, a Professional Advisory Council, or the Advisory Mountain. That's in September. And then in October, we're going to be talking with women successors who have transitioned into the CEO role from their father or from their mother. And I'm really excited for that one. That's going to happen in October. So a big, huge thank you, Ian, to you, Mike, to you, and to each of you for joining us. You're welcome to tune in again and reach out if you have questions.
Thanks, Sally. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Take care.
Bye-bye.